And this evening's conversation will be with some colleagues who have been able to make a career transition into independent schools over a period of time, and they'll talk a little bit about their individual stories. And then we will, near the end, have an opportunity, if there are questions from anyone who is joining us live, you can certainly ask the question. If you have a specific circumstances that you want to explore further, we always invite you to email jobfair@nysais.org, and I am very happy to help you out. My name is Liz Fernandez. I'm currently serving as the Job Fair Administrator with NYSAIS. I've been in this role for 21 plus years, and I also was able to attend the job fair many years ago and secure the first position within independent schools. So needless to say, this is a very special event for me, and we're thrilled that it's happening virtually, and we aim to be able to support everyone who is out there who is interested in a position at an independent school, either teaching or administrative, because we aim to not only support the community at this difficult time, we also want to be sure that we increase the number of teachers and administrators of color within our schools. So without further ado, I want to welcome my colleagues and friends to tonight's conversation. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. And then from there, I'll just be asking a series of questions. Brandy, I'm going to ask you to go first. Maria, I'm going to ask you to go second. And Hazel, you will be third. Thanks, and welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Liz, and welcome to people who are here live and people who might see this at some other point. My name is Brandy Melendez. I'm the Director of Equity and Inclusion at the Berkeley Carroll School in Brooklyn, and I've been working at Berkeley Carroll for the last 7 years. This is my 7th year, I guess, is really the truth.
Good evening, everyone. It's nice that you could join us. My name is Maria Nunez. I'm the Upper School Division Head at Packer Collegiate. This is my 2nd year in that job. So a really great moment to move into an administrative position.
Hi, I'm Hazel Hunt, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm a 5th grade teacher at Fieldston Lower, and this is my 10th year at Fieldston.
Great. So one of the things that I think is important for our audience to understand is independent schools. What are independent schools? What kinds of schools do each of you work within? And then from there, transition into what made you consider independent schools, and for you to tell us about your professional journey. So I'm going to ask Maria if you could go first, Hazel second, and Brandy third.
Sure. So I actually transitioned into education relatively recently, so 8 years ago. Up until that point, I had worked in a business career for about 20 years. I had always had a love of education and thought that it would be something I would do at one point in life. And I got to a moment in my previous career where I thought, if not now, then when? And so at that time, knew I had gone to independent schools as a child, and appreciated I have a child who's now in college, who had also gone to schools, and appreciated the educational experience that independent schools offered. So when I first started, spoke with some other administrators, since given my business career had an eye on administration, who advised me that it was really important to teach before looking into an administrative position. So I therefore went back to get a master's in education. I went to Bank Street, and then actually got my first job, Liz, at the Diversity Job Fair 7 years ago. So I worked for 5 years as a math teacher at Spence, which is another independent school, before and was a dean there before starting as the upper school division head at Packer 2 years ago. So Packer is a pre-K through 12 school. We have about 1,000 students. There are 400 students in the upper school, for where I'm a division head. It's a co-ed school and located in downtown Brooklyn, in Brooklyn Heights.
Okay, so very similar to Maria, I actually got my start working in emergency medicine and then in OBGYN as an administrator, and always loved teaching. I worked in the residency program when I was in emergency medicine at Metropolitan Hospital, and there were lots of residents who were coming through and not understanding why some of their Black patients were very apprehensive about medical care. And I said, well, let's talk about, like, you learned about Tuskegee. And they're like, what? And I said, wait, you've never learned of that? And I said, all right, you're going to sit down. And I would sit down and explain what it was. And the residency director said to me, you should really teach. And I was like, well, I thought about it. So I did it. I left a really great job and did a 1-year master's in education. And I started teaching in public schools. So I worked at PS 81 in the Bronx, not far from Fieldston. There you go. As a 5th grade teacher. And I loved it. I loved being part of my community and being a community teacher. And then, lots of things started changing in the public school world. And I wasn't able to teach the way that I wanted to. I'm a progressive teacher. I wanted to teach hands-on. I wanted kids to learn and explore. And I was lamenting this one day. My daughter was in the Summer on the Hill program, and I was subbing there, and someone said, you should look at independent schools. I was like, why would they want me? I'm like, I teach public school. And they said, just why don't you go to this job fair? And so I did, and interviewed lots of different places and landed at Fieldston. And that was 10 years ago. So it's 16 years that I've been teaching. And I would say of utmost importance is when I started looking at the independent world, which I really didn't know a lot about. I thought about where this is an opportunity. Where do I want to teach? What's the type of school that I want to be in? And I really explored what their philosophy of education was for the schools, what it looked like to be teaching and being a student there. And that's why I really was happy to be at Fieldston, that I feel home. And so my children one has graduated and one is there now. But I think for anyone looking to change from public or career changing, really give that thought. What's the type of teacher that you want to be in? What's the environment that you want to be in?
Thank you. That's so interesting, you see, because we just met, Hazel, but the reason I made that expression that I didn't fix was the fact that I went to PS 81. I grew up in Riverdale and went to that school, and then, another school for middle school in Riverdale as well, in the Bronx. And then I went to an independent school for high school. I'm an Oliver Scholar alumna, and went to the Horace Mann School. And my mom still lives in that area. But I sort of think about my journey to this point as a sort of connection to education and sort of a circle back, and I didn't really figure this out until like the last maybe 2 or 3 years after I had done it, because so I did my sort of undergraduate work in psychology, but had a social and developmental focus, and took a lot of education courses, and actually worked in a daycare throughout my whole time in college as an assistant teacher. So I was like that floating teacher in the early childhood person who goes to the classroom that needs the relief, and that was my work study in college. And then when I was done with school, I was like, I cannot do school anymore. I need to apply some of this knowledge. And I went into human resources. So I worked in the human resources field for 15 years, working, at first for a very small company that grew and grew and grew. And then at some point, in my last role there, I was a VP of HR for about a 700 person company. And, someone said like a great job, and I use air quotes because in many ways it was what I was like aspiring to do, the next thing. But then I got to looking at what that next thing was and realized I had lost so much of the joy and connection and passion around what it is I was doing, and started to think about, like, what is it that will be more fulfilling? I'm a person who works a lot. It's just like part of who I am. And so, similar to some of what I'm hearing, I really started thinking about my own independent school experience, my own educational experience when I was looking for schools for my daughter, who's now in 7th grade. I have a daughter who's in 7th and a son who's in 5th. And I became connected with the Berkeley Carroll School through my role as a parent initially, and I won't go through the whole part of the story, but, as I started to think about this, DEI work was a part of what I was responsible for within the HR function, but just a slice of it, hiring and recruiting and retention, all that stuff too. And so I've always been passionate about sort of this role of thinking about what it means to be create equitable and inclusive school communities. I certainly was very much influenced by my own experience attending Horace Mann as a high school student, and really wanted to, it really framed my thinking about what I wanted for my own children, and then what I want for the students that I help to whose experience I help to influence. Berkeley Carroll is also a pre-K 3, so 3s through 12th grade, about 980 students in Brooklyn. And it's through my connection initially as a parent that I transitioned into this role as Director of Equity and Inclusion. And I would say that, the prior experience, and I know, sort of in thinking about career changing, in some ways, I feel like I came back to education, but I really do apply a lot of what I did in my prior role in this role as I think about what it means to cultivate community, what it means to think about equity, what it means to value a diversity of perspectives. And certainly a big part of my role is hiring, recruiting, retention, et cetera. And so that's a little bit about my story.
Thank you. It's fascinating because one of you is coming from a health and medical field perspective, one of you is coming from business perspective, and one of you is coming from an HR perspective. And it's amazing how all of our schools are really lucky to have welcomed you, however long ago it was that you made the transition. Brandy, you started us, down this idea of what were the skills that for you were transferable. And I think it was an excellent segue. If we could hear from Maria and Hazel, what were those transferable skills that you were able to apply from your previous role into that first initial role? And then how have you grown as a result? Super curious to hear.
Yeah. It was fascinating to see how many skills did transfer and then where I needed to adapt, given the different demands. One thing I learned very early, and I'm so glad I went back to school and coming into schools, schools and businesses are very different environments in that there's a greater it's like The Godfather, it's not personal, it's business. On the business side, that you can divorce yourself from the work that you do, and quote unquote leave it at the office. Schools are very personal. And so it is about investing who you are, because you're dealing with the development of others. You're dealing with children and families and really fundamental issues of development. And so that's where, I agree that the mission of each school is very important. And it's also where who you are as a person is what's directly transferable. In terms of the work that you do and the essence of yourself that you put into the work. So if you have a love of children and if you have a love of learning for yourself and for others, then those are directly transferable skills. For my time in the classroom, I had worked I'm a trained mathematician and an economist, and a lot of what I did in my day-to-day life, I was able to infuse into my teaching in the classroom. When I was at Bank Street, I did elementary ed. So it was a little, as I was working with first and second graders, it was a little bit less. When I started teaching full time, it was high school. So, was able to put more of what I knew from my business world in. The same in classroom management is about being organized and understanding the people with whom you are working. And so you are working with children, the people with whom you share space. So that as well was directly transferable. I loved teaching. I was not in a hurry, ironically, to get into administration, even though that's where I had started. And so it was serendipity of a position that was available, that was a school that I really admired and applied. If not, I would have been very happy to keep teaching for longer. The skills that I built in the business world were more directly applicable now to administration, because it is helping to run a school and be a leader in a school, but with all of the differences of a school culture and the type of work that we're doing. And for that, the most transferable is then what I learned in the classroom as well, in working directly with teachers.
Thank you. Hazel.
So yeah, I'm kind of piggybacking off Maria. I would say, I think main skills for me coming out of working in a hospital in emergency medicine was the organizational skills. So classroom management is largely about being able to manage that classroom and thinking about the needs of your individual students and then as the class as a whole. And I think also it was learning how, working in medicine, especially in emergency medicine and then in OBGYN, was lots of different constituents, right? There's lots of people who all have to have their needs met. It's the patient and the patient's family and the doctors and the nurses. And I was an administrator, so it was really balancing all of those needs. And it's the same thing in the classroom. Your students have needs, but the parents have needs, and your administrators and your colleagues. And how do you balance all of those as a teacher? So those were definitely skills that I transferred. And then I think that another huge thing is just being able to listen. You know, as an administrator, it's listening and also figuring out what a person is saying or what their needs are, and then helping support them in that way. So in the classroom, it's a lot, for me, it's a lot about listening to what the students are saying, what they're not saying, what their parents are saying, what they're not saying, and figuring out how do I support each one of my students as individuals, and then how do I support them as a class. So I think those are definitely skills that most people coming out of any career, if your career changing, these are skills that you can transfer. I can't think of a career where you wouldn't have something that you could transfer and bring into the classroom. And I think that's important to remember and hold on to, because that's what makes me a unique teacher and makes each of us unique in what we do. You know, I said I didn't go the traditional route, you know, and I didn't even go to a traditional graduate school, right? And that brings something special to me into my classroom, you know. And I tease my parents at the beginning of every year, and my students, I'm like, I worked in emergency medicine. There's nothing your fifth grader is going to do that's going to spook me, right? And that's something individual that I get to bring to my classroom.
Terrific. You know, it's amazing as I hear each of you, and I'm sort of drawn more and more into your stories and how much I appreciate the process. And sort of the strength and the conviction and the trust at the moment that you must have had as you were considering this transition. You know, given we're currently navigating twin pandemics, you know, the global health pandemic that we're all living through, and the systemic racism that continues to be part of you know, unfortunately, the legacy of our country and of our world, quite frankly. There may be a fair amount of trepidation that someone might be thinking about as they try to transfer and make that career transition at this moment. And I'm super curious if you could speak to what advice would you offer candidates, you know, as they prepare for the hiring process, given all that is happening. You know, it might be overwhelming, and yet for some folks, because of the economy and the decisions, the difficult decisions that some people have had to make, they've had to really consider beyond being, for instance, an accountant in a particular type of, you know, career. Schools need accountants too. Schools need dedicated and talented teachers who know how to manage all the things that you mentioned earlier, both the classroom and the expectations and all of that. Schools also need people who are able to speak you know, with exceptional conviction about the mission of the school, you know, as part of an admissions team, and so on and so forth. So some of those skills are easily transferable. What advice would you offer candidates who are contemplating this particular transition career-wise at this moment that might be incredibly overwhelming? Brandy, can you start, and Hazel, and then Maria will end up with you? That'd be great. Thanks.
Yes. So I so appreciate that question. You know, and I've been thinking a lot about it as we've begun to, you know, get connected to our hiring season this year. Because I think, to your point, Liz, you know, this moment of dual pandemics, this moment where we really had to like think very critically about what we value as individuals, as what we value as institutions, what we hope that we're doing when we teach or work in schools. And I would say that anybody who works in a school is an educator, because we're all supporting that. So, you know, I think the advice I would have for candidates, especially, you know, considering a career transition, thinking about making what may feel like a leap, is that this is a moment in time where many people recognize and are thinking about like what they really value, what is really important, and what they want to do. And so lots of people are making decisions that are a little bit different than they would have made them a year ago. But the things that are true to you, the things that are true to, that are like that you take with you no matter what space you're in are really something that's important to come through in a hiring process and in a decision-making process when you're thinking about what the kind of community you want to join is. I would say also that we, many of us, in education very much value the social emotional piece of being educators, right? And again, if we knew it before, we really know it now, that like we can't do none of the things we want to do with our students and in our communities if we don't take care of ourselves and the kids. And so really thinking about how you convey that as like an important and crucial aspect of what you plan to do in a school community. And then the other thing I would, sort of the advice that I would give is, to really, and this is no matter what the moment we're in, like to really, as you're considering specific institutions, learn about them, glean as much as you can from their websites, from the conversations, and think of it as it's a mutual interview process. And when you're sort of meeting people, right? The questions that you are asked say as much about what a school values as the questions that you ask them. And so, like really get to know the institutions, really think about what you want, and sort of do your best to convey who you are authentically in the process, so that as you engage in the process, you're sort of being true to yourself and schools can really get to know you. In this, like, I remember very clearly the first time last year that I did Zoom interviews, right, where people weren't coming to have their day and visit. And it felt like, oh, I can't believe this is how we're doing it. It was like a rare occasion before. And now this is what we do. So everyone's in transition and sort of honoring that.
Brandy, I agree with everything that you said. I think practically for the process, I know that for myself, when I career changed, that was huge. And I remember pinning on my refrigerator how much money I was not going to make walking into DOE after leaving my administrative job. I'm like, do you really want to do this? And I did, right? This is what you love. And I think, Brandy, that's what you said, right? It's finding and saying, this is what I love and this is what I want to do. And that's what's most important to me. So I've held to that. And then my next leap was leaving the public school world and going into the independent world. And again, actually when I was hired as a 1-year leave replacement, and I was leaving a tenured position in DOE. And my colleagues in public were like, are you insane? What are you doing? And I said, I have to try this. I really think I'm going to be happier there. And so for anyone that has that trepidation in this moment, I would say try. And the worst that's going to happen is that you're going to have to find another job at another time. I tell my daughter now, who's 20, the job you have now is not the job you're going to have 20 or 30 years from now when you finish college. And I think that's an important thing for all of us to remember, that the days of staying in a career or even staying in one job for your entire life are pretty rare, and that's okay. And so take the leap, try it out. I'd say do the job, go to the job fairs. Your resume is another thing that I would say, your CV, make it reflect you and all the amazing things you've done outside of education and within education. And that was someone, actually, my first principal told me, he's like, you told me you did all these things in the interview. Why isn't that on your CV? And I said, well, I'm applying for education positions. And he's like, yeah, but you're a published author and you did all it, you taught. And he's like, add that on, that's you. And I said, oh my gosh, that's really smart. So that would be my advice to you. Whatever you've done in your previous life, find a way to include that, because sometimes when they're reading it, that's going to stand out and hold you out from someone else who may not have such a colorful and wonderful story.
I completely agree with everything that Brandy and Hazel said. And Hazel, you reminded me that actually my first job was also a 1-year leave replacement. So I agree that in looking back, it might be that for career changers, it's also a way of reducing the risk for the school as well as for the individual. The advantage that you have is that once you're in the school, you can demonstrate all of the value that you bring, and the school, if they want to keep you, will find a way to find a job for you or to do. And if not, it gives you the experience and an in to take advantage of an opportunity in another school. So I would absolutely say take the leap of faith and be brave. The second is to really reflect before you start on the process, so that you can tell your story in terms of why you want to go to a school and not why you're leaving your current career. Because it is about the strengths and what you're going to bring that become important. And so that reflection is key. And if you have any contacts, and I'm sure Liz through the job fair, of finding other people who work in independent schools now who are not interviewing you, with whom you can practice telling your story, and they can give you that feedback of when are you using jargon that is from your industry that you believe others will understand and that a school might not. When are you missing the opportunity for them to ask you questions about something in your background or your experience that would be of value to school that you don't realize. So I think the reflection is key, your research is key, and then practice and take this as a moment of exploration and opportunity.
Such excellent tips, all of you already. I want to go down a specific train of thought just to be able to address it, because we've already opened the door a little bit, and that's really, one of the things that I think that gives some individuals trepidation around making the career change is the concerns around salaries and benefits. And while, I'm going to ask a question, I'm not asking for specifics, so please do not hear it that way. More so about sort of at a high level, if that is the reason why someone might not consider making this transition, what would you say to someone to be able to encourage them or to consider thinking about the benefits of all of the components of being in a school, from the simplest things like many of our schools provide meals that are part of the experience, and when you start to calculate, that's worth noting, et cetera, et cetera. And then sort of just share what adjustments and what are the things that people might want to think about that they may not have had at the forefront of their minds initially. I'm just going to open that up. Whoever wants to go, I'm going to invite you to go there.
I'll start off, Liz. And I think this is really important, because like the practical thing, like it's like, okay, well, it's sometimes a shift feels aspirational, or it's like I want to do it, but like you got to do the things, right? And I certainly think that one thing about independent schools is they seem to be set up to really care about faculty and colleagues in a way that is important. I certainly took a decrease in my salary when I made this transition from a senior position on the corporate world. But there are also many other things that are benefits that would not have come to mind in that environment that are benefits of working in an independent school. In addition, independent schools, many of them, and I can't speak for them all obviously, but many can be flexible around things that are other than salary that really have a tangible effect. So you mentioned things like meals, time off, thinking about what the value of your time, thinking about the negotiables around benefits and other things. So where there might be a shift in salary, depending on where you're coming from, it's really worthwhile to have conversations with the institutions you're thinking about the other pieces. But also, kind of as I said before, there are intangibles about working in these kinds of environments that are meaningful, and are not just about the dollars. But again, I'm not I'm a realist. I know the mortgage and the rent, and they have to be paid. But I would just say to think expansively around what it is you think of as compensation, and to really ask questions about that in your interview process if you get to the point where you're talking about accepting an offer or receiving an offer.
I would agree with that, Brandy. I would say, when I transitioned from medicine into education, I did have a pay decrease. But then when I went from public to independent, I actually kind of was sort of lateral, and I calculated out that I would outpace what I would have earned in DOE if I had remained, and that was important. Mortgage, kids, college, all of that. But I think the intangibles are also very important. So the opportunity for professional development at a level that I wouldn't have been able to receive in DOE that is paid for, was very important to me. Meals, absolutely. But I think the other intangible is the experiences. So, as you said, the idea of fostering faculty. When I was hired, I had to be interviewed by every one of the people on my team. And that struck me. I'd never been in an interview process where everyone had to agree that I would fit to work with them. And that was really important to me, that, our principal at the time thought it was important that everyone could play in the sandbox together. And we do. And, these, over the last 10 years, these people have become my family. So there's no price tag that you can put on that. I'd also say, if you're, thinking about leaving another world and coming into education, there is no price tag to be put on seeing a child when they have figured or discovered something, and knowing that you were part of that and help them see. There's no way to ever put a monetary value on that. And then the other thing for me, I think becoming an educator changed my home life. So while I loved my job in emergency medicine, I was on call all the time. I came home and was stressed. Life was hard. And I'm not saying teaching isn't hard, and teaching in a pandemic is really hard. But becoming a teacher changed the quality of life outside of my job, where I came home joyful and happy, and I came home wanting to go to work the next day and excited to do that. You can't put a price tag on those things. And there are days when I would just like to bury my head in the sand. Teachers do that same way as everyone else. But I think those are things you need to consider as well. So are you very, very happy in the job that you're doing, or you feel like there's a piece of you that's not fulfilled? I was happy in my job, but I realized that I was helping doctors and other people advance their careers, and I wasn't doing something that was fulfilling myself. And by teaching and knowing that I'm making a difference in my community, that makes a difference. That I feel good about that. And there's no price tag that you can put onto that.
I completely agree. I mean, for me, if this is what you want to do, if this is where your soul sings, there is nothing better than feeling like you're in sync with what you're doing. And my friends and family laugh, because I will say, well, when I used to work, and they'll say, but you have a job now. I'm like, yeah, but it's not work. This is what I do. And I do get up, and even in the pandemic and with all the craziness, I do love my job. And that's not something that I could say with such conviction before, because I think while I appreciated my job and everything that I did, and got rewarded for it, it didn't feed me in the same way that work in education does. It's also really important to be practical and know your own personal situation and as you're budgeting, because Brandy and Hazel, I did take a significant pay cut when I came into education. Depending on the schools, the pace of advancement in salary, it's not the same as in the private sector. And most schools pay based on tenure, more so than pay based on performance. So that's, if you're coming from a for-profit world into education, that's a very big difference. And if you're starting off early in your career, you have to realize that your pace of increase in salary won't be the same. But there are things that you can do because of the structure of the school year. So if you've done your budgeting and you say, I need more than what I make on a teacher's salary, there are people who work during the summer in order to make additional money. Depending on what you teach or what your job is in a school, there are tutoring opportunities that people do as well. So there are other ways to supplement your financial income. At schools and at ours, there are additional responsibilities that you can take on that are often stipended. So you're given an additional amount of salary, whether that's for coaching or for taking on some leadership positions in different ways. But teaching is not an industry that you go into for the money. And so if you are passionate about it and happy in it, it will feel very fulfilling. If it is not something that financially fits with you or your lifestyle, then I think that is something that you would have to pay careful attention to.
Thank you so much. So we've started to talk a little bit about the hiring process and what are some of the things that unfolded during the course of, some of the transitions. Hazel, you spoke about, you were interviewed by everyone to make sure that, everyone could play in the sandbox. And Brandy, you talked about Zoom. This is what we do now. And recognizing that every independent school, and I just want to plug at this moment, the NYSAIS Job Fair to promote diversity as of today has 90 schools registered to virtually engage with candidates across New York State and beyond New York State And we're very, very excited about that, with positions in a variety of different areas and fields. I also want to say that so many of our schools still aren't 100% certain the vacancies that they have or that they will anticipate. So it's going to be a little bit different in terms of knowing exactly what positions are open. I am predicting that the hiring season will extend into April, May. Some of that will have to do with comfort levels with individuals in terms of decisions that they need to make. Some of it will be about corporate decisions that families will need to make. If someone is employed in the corporate sector, some places have already made decisions. They're not going to go back to a brick and mortar institution. They're going to stay virtual, which creates greater flexibility. The other thing that I think will be true, particularly for our schools, is, it is amazing what classroom teachers are able to do at this moment, given the extraordinary challenges. It is amazing what our administrators are and all of our colleagues within our schools are able to do. Some of our schools are in person. Some of our schools are kind of part in, part out. Some are completely remote. And that's kind of the way the hiring process is going to be like. So if each of you could talk about what can candidates expect from the hiring process? And we want to say that depending on when you watch this is right now. It may change at any moment. So keeping it real with everyone. What can candidates expect? Maria, can you kick us off, and then Hazel, and then Brandy to add to that?
So I think there will be some parts that are similar to the past, and we're in our hiring season now, in which there are 3 rounds in a hiring process. It would be a first round where there would be an initial screening of resumes that are submitted, and you might get and schools will hire based on certain criteria that they're looking for in terms of the discipline or that. Then there will often be a screening round, which would be a short interview. We're doing all of those on Zoom. From there, usually a panel of semifinalists, and that would, again, in this world, be based on Zoom and maybe with a hiring committee. And then usually we will invite finalists into a more intensive interview process, similar to what Hazel had mentioned before, where you meet many more people within the school, teach a demo, if it's for a teaching position, teach a demo lesson, and we still say spend the day at the school, though you're virtual at the school. There's not a physical space, though we do, and with finalists, we'll give them an opportunity to come see the school on a weekend. It's empty, but just to see. So some of the process is the same, though it's all virtual. As Liz said, though, we are anticipating that the hiring season will go longer because many of our teachers are making decisions about next year in ways that they hadn't had in the past. So teachers are deciding whether or not they're going to stay in New York or leave and leave the city. There were some of our teachers who were, past a typical retirement age, for a love of teaching. And this is a year where they decide that it might be time to retire. I mean, it's been a tough year for everyone. So because of that, there will be more fluidity in the hiring cycle. So where normally we would do our hiring by our spring break period, so by mid-March, I anticipate as well that it'll go on, and even April into early May.
I would say, everything that Maria just said, I echo. I think just being flexible through this process and expect just a lot of virtual work and virtual meetings. I would say, as a teacher, doing the demo lesson for me was a really important way to show how I would be in a classroom. And so if you're planning that, I would say think now about what that would look like for you on a meet or on a Zoom call, right? So how can you share with your students, and how can you present? I imagine that next year we're going to be in a very similar situation, right? Not everyone's going to be vaccinated. I'm sorry, Maria. I came from medicine. We're still going to be social distance to a point. We're still going to be wearing masks. In my school, I'm in 1 week and out 1 week because we didn't have enough space for our 5th graders. So I'm teaching remotely one week and then I'm in the building one week. So I would imagine that it's not going to be like 2019 when we walk into the school year in September. So think about that as you're planning your demo lesson. How can you show this school that you can be flexible in this hybrid learning environment? I think that's really important. And that's very different from, if you were interviewing a year ago. So how can what quick things can a student pull up to use as a manipulative to, do this demo lesson? What can you put up on your screen that's going to be, will catch them and teach that lesson? And those are things that we wouldn't have thought of a year ago or so when you were doing a demo lesson. You could bring your bag of tricks with you and you'd be in the classroom and interact with kids. So I think it's a great way for you to be able to show what you can do in this hybrid learning environment, and then really be able to demonstrate to that team and to that school that you can do this job.
Agree with all the points that you all are making. I think I'll spend a little bit of time talking about sort of the things that might be asked of candidates to get them into that moment, which is like a resume or a CV. And I just Maria, when you said this, I realized this is something I often say about the narrative. Like, think about what is your story. We in schools and education, we love a good story. And so what does your resume say about you, or your CV, depending on sort of your levels of experience? I do agree with thinking about including the things that you're gonna be able, when you're telling your story, to connect to your work in a school for whatever position that you're applying for. So think about that ahead. And then I also want to just highlight, because I see this, it's like really look at what is being asked of for the submission of materials. So it's always a resume or a CV. Sometimes it's an educational philosophy statement, or it's asking you to respond, and a cover letter. Sometimes you're asked to respond to a specific question in your cover letter or in your statement. And so I would really encourage people to really look specifically at each job. I think one of the things that happens when you are, submitting your materials for many different positions in schools, it can get it's easy to sort of lose track of what school is asking for what. An educational philosophy statement is sort of like a narrative of your beliefs around why you do what you do, the way that you approach it, what's on your mind, and what you hope to achieve. If I were going to sort of like make it bullet pointed, again, this is another way to tell your story. If I were doing my philosophy statement, I would start with the fact that I was in this other thing, and I transitioned from this other thing to this, and here is what I realized about that, and here I go from there. You know what I mean? And sort of like using every opportunity you have to tell your story through those materials. I would say also, and maybe it's obvious, but like a reminder, like have somebody else look at them and make sure there are no typos, no sort of mistakes. It's very easy when you are doing all these things and sending them off. And then, and I do think, unfortunately, for institutions that have a lot of applicants, small little things that might be just an overstep or a misstep on your part turn into something that takes you from like a yes and pile to like a there's a mistake there. And so I just encourage people to really look carefully at the directions and think about, I do think that for people who are transitioning from, not in the educational field, thinking about your educational philosophy can be challenging. So any connections you have, any folks you can talk to who might help you think through that, to sort of articulate your vision as you're, about even why you're making the shift, I would encourage.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce what Brandy said about the importance of those materials, because there are a lot of applicants, and all of us in schools are even busier than we've ever been before. And so the risk is that it's a quick look at resumes as we're starting. And so it's really important, as Brandy said, that you follow the directions, because attention to detail and organization is a critical skill of an educator. And so that would be enough to take you out of the pile. If the information was asked to be delivered in a certain way and you didn't. The other is to pay attention to your cover letter, so that it does feel that you've given specific attention to this opportunity at this school. It is your first chance, is your first introduction, and it will be, schools can tell if it is a boilerplate letter that you just kind of cut and paste a school's name in, and that would not do you a service. So in your research of paying attention to the mission of the school and the particularities of the position.
Thank you
Can I
so
say,
much. Yeah,
can I say
please.
one more thing that Maria made me think of is this, the way that the job descriptions are written, there's usually sort of like a core set of like, here's what we're looking for. And then these like preferred or, sometimes required, sometimes preferred, or would be nice if. I would say, sometimes I see people say like, oh, I don't have this or this. I would really encourage you to, again, going back to this narrative piece, to not be too discouraged if you don't have every single thing on that list of bullet points, because like there are very few people that have every single thing on that list of bullet points in that resume. Like those job descriptions are very aspirational. Like if we were waving our magic wand and we found the perfect person that would do all the things, this is all the things, these are all the things. And like I think people who are in the positions of reviewing them really know that very few people have all the things. So just if you're very interested in something, if you're very interested in a school, if you have many of the things or can tell that story about how you're planning to get those things, I think it's worth sort of pursuing it. So I wanted to add that.
Excellent suggestion. All of you, just really excellent perspectives, suggestions. Hazel, you had alluded to it a little bit. I mean, we're talking about a teaching demo and or designing a lesson plan. And so each of you has a completely different perspective that I would love for you to speak to. What are observers seeking to determine either during a teaching demo, which means it's more than likely not going to be in person this time around, or perhaps a school might ask to design a lesson plan, or if it's for an administrative position, for instance, our operations offices, or finance departments, or, there's so many different roles within a school that allow that school to operate. Really important. What would you say people are looking to identify in those moments? Any of you could start and then,
Yeah, I mean, I can say, I've been on hiring committees for our school and we've hired new faculty. So I've been on both sides. And as an observer, to me, I come in understanding that this is a contrived situation, right? And especially now during a pandemic, when you're doing a demo lesson that you are doing virtually, or if you're sending in a lesson plan that someone's just going to read and you're not going to be there to talk off of it, it's very different than real life. So know that we're not in the gotcha. But for me, I look for what's the interaction? How is this person interacting with students? And you can be nervous. I know during my demo lesson, I was using the smart board and I literally forgot to touch the board. I was using the mouse instead. And I'm like, I know how to use a smart board, right? You're nervous. But I think it's the way that you interact with the kids and how you draw them in. Are you excited about what you're teaching? Are you getting them excited? Are you feeding off of where they are and really reading your audience, right? I want to see that educator can tell when they're losing someone, or can look in that child's face and be like, you don't quite get it, right? And those are things of an excellent teacher, and that's what I look for during a demo lesson. In a lesson plan, I would say, again, you're trying to show yourself through this lesson. So if you're tasked with giving a specific lesson, think about what is it in this lesson that you can use to shine, show off yourself. So you're definitely not going to find some cookie cutter one off the internet and then kind of just tweak it a little bit. Really be authentic in creating that lesson plan, and think about who are the students that you would be teaching, and really consider the diverse learners that might be in that room. So it might be different if you're in a teaching environment now. Consider that you might have students with different learning needs, or students that have different language issues, or really consider that and put that into your lesson plan as well, to show your, that's another thing I look for, is are they considering the diverse learner? So those would be a couple of things I would suggest.
I think the other thing is we're in a crazy topsy-turvy world right now. And so when I'm observing, it's really looking for how someone reacts when things go wrong. And one of our favorite questions is, tell me about something that went wrong and then how you handled it. Because all of our teachers have really have had to relearn to teach in two different ways in the last year. The first is going online, and then the second for us is we're in a hybrid where we're partially on campus and partially remote. So there's a lot of support and forgiveness and grace in things not going according to plan. You know, that there might be a glitch in the technology. The students that you have on the screen that day may not engage because, and for no fault of your own. You know, they were up all night, they didn't do something. It's so as we're observing, it's really looking for the intent and for the individual and that authenticity of being present in the moment and being able to keep your eye on the learning goal and what you're there to do, even when everything goes wrong. I mean, and some of the strongest demos are when everything goes wrong, and yet the teacher has a sense of humor, is able to adapt and still connect and get somewhere in the lesson that was nothing what was planned, but was exactly what was needed in the moment.
Yeah, I agree with all that. You know, I think, you know, just concretely also, like, being comfortable with the technology that you're going to be asked to use when you're doing a demo, and like practicing and thinking through every step of what you've planned is important. And, you know, the way you react when the thing goes wrong or when the students don't do what you anticipate is a really important thing. But the other thing I would add, I think, specifically if we're talking about demo lessons that wasn't explicitly said, is something that we always think about is after the demo lesson that's been observed, a candidate's ability to reflect upon what went well and what didn't go so well, or what they would do differently. And so this idea of like, how do you assess yourself and how accurate is that? How much is it like what other people might notice is really important, because that's an indication of the fact that you're willing to sort of think about your own practice and be open to feedback and have a conversation about what could go better in a way that makes people feel like, oh, this is somebody I can collaborate with in the future. I think if you're interviewing for a position that's not a teaching position, that's not a demo, I think the rapport is still true. Like thinking about how you are able to, even though it's hard to do. I mean, like, I really, really honor the fact that it's hard to go into a Zoom room with strangers and like be authentic and tell your story and do these things, but this is like what it is now. And so trying to develop a rapport, you know, sort of not just following a script, but really listening to the questions that are being asked. And I would also say, maybe this is like really the other question, but coming with questions that you have for the people that you're meeting. When I say, what questions do you have for me? And people say, I don't have any questions. I'm like, ooh, you know, it's like, it's hard. And I know that you've talked to a lot of people in an institution that's doing a really tight hiring process. Will make sure that you haven't answered the same questions 10 times. But, you know, like, think, even if you ask every single person you meet the same question, and you are assessing like how consistent or not are the answers that you're getting from the different people, like, have a great question to ask.
Fantastic suggestions. We're transitioning to the final question. I also want to recognize that our fourth panelist, Roland Garrison, has been able to join. And so, Roland, we are thrilled. We know that you were, you know, intending to be here, and that, you know, just life happened, and that's okay because you're with us now. We're going to invite you to just introduce yourself, the role at your school, and tell us a little bit about your career transition. And then you will answer the question that everyone else will conclude on, which is, other than the amazing students we are fortunate to work with, what keeps you in these schools? So Roland, we're going to start with you, and then I'm going to invite Hazel, Brandy, and finish with Maria. Okay.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Excuse my tardiness. My name is Roland Garrison. I work at the Village Community School in Greenwich Village in New York. And my role there, this year I teach third grade social studies. My background is in dance. I was in the military for 10 years, and I worked in high-end fashion for about 8 years before becoming a teacher. I did my master's at the Bank Street College of Education. I did a summer there, and just to see if it was something I might be interested in. And I was so inspired by my first professor, who just sat with the book she wrote and taught the class. I said, wow, this is a real intellectual. And I'm quirky that way. So I was sold that was something that I wanted to pursue. I was fortunate enough to start off as a teaching assistant at the Packard Collegiate Institute, and decided that I wanted to work in charter school. and went to charter school for a few years and realized that independent schools were probably a better fit for me because of my level of creativity and the way I like to present lessons. There was structure, but I knew there was more room for creativity in the independent school market. So I returned there. I love working with the students. I'm very fortunate to be in that situation. And just to go back to a question I heard earlier about how do educators subsidize their income if we do take a salary cut. I was going to say that summers are free, and people think that educators will have a halo. So I, humbly speaking, of course, things just came up. I ended up working at the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater because they were looking for someone to teach creative writing. And my name came up, and I had an interview. And I was wondering at the end of the interview, I thanked them for interviewing me and was looking forward to hearing from them. And they emailed me back to say, "You got the job. What are you talking about?" And so I'd never been hired on the spot. So that was so new. I was like, oh, okay. So we're very fortunate to have the students that we have. And what keeps me from returning to any of my previous careers is that everything I've done in the past, although for some people it may seem like, oh, you were indecisive in your early life, oh, you were just a crazy gypsy. That's not it. It's that everything that I've done in the past has come to fruition in the classroom. And I don't want to return to any of my previous jobs. I'm happy, I'm content, I have found my niche.
I love that, Roland. I would say for me, there's a few things. It's one, knowing that I have a role to play in the future. I have children, and I want to know that the world that I'm helping these children grow up in is the world that is just and equitable for everyone. And so teaching students how to learn is a reason why I want to stay in this job. And I think the other piece for me as a teacher of color is that my students, there's value in my students seeing a teacher of color. When Kamala Harris took oath, one of my students said, "She looks like me." And I said, "Baby, yeah, she does, right? And she looks like us." And that's an important moment for my students of color and for my white students to see. And so that's without a doubt, when I have these really horrible days, what keeps me going is that they don't get to see lots of teachers of color. And so to see a teacher of color doing well and being able to have that connection with all of my students is what keeps me coming back.
I mean, yeah, for me, it's sort of similar to what Hazel said. What keeps me, in addition to the amazing students and like sort of all those wonderful moments is, I fundamentally believe that education, what we do in education, has the capacity to make change. And I think about both the experiences that we community members, students, and adults have in our institutions, but also the capacity for what we do to influence real change in the future is what keeps me doing it. I really still believe that, even though it's very hard on some days.
I agree. I think my colleagues and the mission of our school keep me so fulfilled. We've made a very strong commitment to be an anti-racist school, and it's incredibly inspiring to me and fulfilling and hard and worthwhile to be doing that work. And I feel very, very lucky to be doing that alongside the group of people that are in our school building. And I feel a real privilege of being a part of an intellectual community that's also a community of care. And so to go into that building every day and feel how much I'm learning and how much I'm stretching, and the humor and the ambition to make the world different from all of the people that I work with is just, I couldn't imagine doing anything else.
Thank you all so much. To those of you that have joined us live, this would be your opportunity. If there's a question that's fairly general, as I mentioned at the beginning, if there is a question that is specific to your individual circumstances, I welcome an email to jobfair@NYSAIS.org for us to connect. If there's a general question that you would like to pose, you are invited to unmute yourself or enter it into the chat. And if you do not have questions, that is also okay, because you can always email jobfair@nysais.org and you will get a response. Okay. So I want to just close, first of all, recognizing Brandy, Hazel, Roland, Maria. Thank you so much for sharing with us your stories, your journey. Our schools, our students, our families, our colleagues are exceptionally lucky to have each of you serving in whatever roles, and we know it's plural, you're all serving in. And the value add that you bring to our schools each and every day is really immeasurable. So I really want to thank you, each of you. I want to recognize my colleague, George Swain from NYSAIS. Thank you for the behind the scenes tech support. I want to thank everyone who's participated today live, and those of you who are viewing, who are considering our schools. And I also want to recognize and just create a final context. Many colleagues of color have successfully navigated this transition into our schools from a variety of communities and career paths. It is really important for you to think that anything is possible, because anything really is possible at this moment. And you know, I really believe that. I want to encourage those of you considering to please register for the NYSAIS Job Fair to promote diversity. I promise you it is the only job fair of its kind. It is a free opportunity to register. I'm happy to talk you through it if you need assistance. Please look at our school websites on the NYSAIS Job Fair, on the NYSAIS website. NYSAIS is spelled NYSAIS.org. Take a look at the career section of the NYSAIS website. I recognize looking for a job is a job in itself. I encourage you all to be patient with yourself and to consider the opportunities that are before you. And on Saturday, February 20th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., if you register, you will have an extraordinary opportunity to explore what's possible at some of our schools. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, colleagues and panelists, and we wish you a good evening.